haven't had a chance to meet you yet, and you're here with us for the first or maybe even second time, my name's Dan Kohler, and I'm the lead pastor here. We're glad that you chose to meet us and be with us today. Today's going to be, if today is your first time with us, today's a really good Sunday to be with us first time, because we're going to be laying out something that is going to be very close to the heart of this church. And it has to do really with relationships. Now, when Janine and I were just starting to date, she was 15 and I was 17. And I know it only seems like, Dan, it looks like you're 17 today. How could that be? You're too kind. Thank you. So she was 15, I was 17. Her parents didn't want her dating until she was 16. It wasn't going to be super long, so we just kind of hung out a little bit. We hung out in groups, or we'd, go to really public spaces and not have a date together. But, it was a good time. And then finally there came the point where we needed to, do the define the relationship sort of a conversation. She wanted to know, what are we? Are we dating? Are we not dating? And so I kind of had this, what I thought was a really romantic time planned out in my mind, as romantic as you can be for 16 and 17. And I took her to what I thought was a very nice restaurant in the town we lived in at the time. Really, it's just like a normal, family restaurant, but I was like, it kind of has this old building atmosphere. It's probably pretty romantic. It's not, Anywhere they serve huge stacks of onion rings just on a wooden dowel is not the most romantic place. Is good, but it wasn't romantic. So I took her to this restaurant, and I thought during dinner, I'm gonna ask her, will you be my girlfriend? Nobody else, just me and you. But the whole meal, I could not work it up. I just couldn't get up the courage to do it. And I was so nervous, even though I knew what she was going to say. I knew she wanted to be in this kind of exclusive dating relationship as well. But I couldn't work up the nerve to do it. And so finally, dinner's over, the bill comes, I pay the bill, and we get up and we walk from the back of the restaurant all the way through the crowds. And as I'm following behind her, I'm like, hey, so you want to do this? You want to make it official? And she just keeps walking. We were going through crowds, and it was a little bit loud, but not that loud. I know she heard me. She knew she heard me, but she just ignored it. Okay? And so I'm like, well, I'm already awkward to start. I have a baseline of awkward, and then you add that scenario to it, just gets more awkward. I'm like, I'm going to have to do this again. I didn't even have a good pitch, but I'm going to have to do it again. And so we get outside of the restaurant, and I'm like, hey, tap her on the shoulder, catch up with her. You want to do this? And she just gives me a look, that's not how you do this. She was hoping for this really nice kind of ask, meaningful connection. And I gave her this thing. But you know what? She said yes. And I didn't have game. I never claimed to be good in dating relationships. It's a good thing Janine accepted me, because I don't think anybody else would. And so now it's, happily ever after. But we had to have that moment where it's this define the relationship sort of moment. And she wanted a very clear understanding of who are we going to be together. Now, it actually doesn't matter whether you're dating or not dating, in a friendship, in a marriage, in a family relationship, whatever it is, that same kind of principle of understanding what expectations in a relationship are actually incredibly important. One of the foundational things for healthy relationships is to be able to clearly articulate clear expectations of the other person, and then be able to live with grace, mercy, and forgiveness when we don't measure up, right? That is at the heart of it, but you have to have a moment where you define that sort of a relationship. Well, here's the thing. I think in the church, we've actually been really, really bad at defining the relationship between a follower of Jesus and Jesus. I really think we have. We're just if we can't clear the bar here, we should just probably lower the bar. Oh, we're still struggling there? All right, I think we got a little bit more room. We could probably lower the bar. It's too low for limbo at this point, but it's easy to step over. That's kind of what we've done with our relationship with Jesus in the church. And I think that's multifaceted. The reason we got there, the reason it is that way is probably very complex in the American society. We don't really have time to go into all the nuances. But what I am interested in doing for us today is offering us a very clear understanding of what it takes to be a disciple of Jesus. I want to give us a very clear on-ramp to following Jesus, or maybe, honestly, for even some of us, maybe today is a day you're like, that's actually not for me. Now, it kind of seems weird for a pastor to say that, right? But I think if we look to a particular story about Jesus, you're going to find that Jesus actually did this defining, and it was a very clear decision point for people. So I want to invite you to turn with me in your Bible to Luke chapter 14. If you have a Bible, otherwise you can Google it on your phone or look it up on the Bible app or however you want to find it. It'll also be on the screen above. But we're going to be in Luke chapter 14, and we're going to read verses 25 through 35. Now, this is it's really a biography of Jesus' life written by a guy named Luke. And out of the 4 biographies we have of Jesus in Scripture, Luke is the only one that did not follow Jesus during his earthly ministry. He came along later, but what he did is he wanted to set what he considered to be an orderly account of Jesus' life and his teaching based on a lot of firsthand eyewitness interviews that he had done, a lot of stories that he had heard about Jesus that he was able to corroborate through interviews with people and collect their stuff. Now, everybody else that had a biography of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, and John, they were all followers of Jesus at one level, except for Mark. He was around, but he again was a disciple of other disciples. But Matthew and John, they were with Jesus. Their biographies were like their perspective of Jesus' life. But Luke is a little bit different in that it's a collection of eyewitness events. It's a collection of stories about who Jesus was and what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. Now, what I find fascinating is if your job is to write a biography of somebody, right, you're going to probably make sure that your biography is formatted in a way that draws people in, right? People don't become best-selling authors of any genre by writing something they know is going to repel people. It's just not a good strategy. So what I find fascinating is the story we're about to read that Luke includes in his biography of Jesus is not probably the most winsome story of Jesus. But let's dive in. Verse 25. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate their father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able, with 10,000 men, to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off, and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." Now, this is an interesting story. It's a very challenging story to us as well. And I believe this morning has the opportunity to be very challenging for us, for every one of us. Now, we start off looking at the story of Jesus. There's just this simple narrative description before Jesus starts talking. And the description that we're given is that large crowds were traveling with Jesus. Jesus had been following them. We pick back up in verse 25. Jesus was followed by a large crowd, and he turns to them. Now, what Jesus is about to say is like public speaking faux pas. Like you don't do it. In today's society, like a large crowd would communicate success. Like everything is built around gathering a following, even in the church. We give more preference, we give more status, we give more respect and admiration to larger churches because they're able to gather a larger crowd. They must be doing something right. Now, that's not entirely wrong either, okay? So it's not like let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I mean, whole businesses, whole companies are created on helping people gain followers. And then you can take those followers and you can turn it into income, right? Like following, having this large crowd is it's a coveted thing in today's society. And even in Jesus' time, a crowd meant influence, especially a crowd following a rabbi, a teacher. You're not a very good teacher if you can't draw people together. And so Jesus would go from town to town teaching, and he would do incredible things. Jesus was doing the miraculous. Now, the miraculous, I think, is really, really hard for the American church to wrap its mind around. The mere fact that supernatural things can happen, it messes with our thinking, and we have a hard time accepting it. Even when we do accept it, we think, no, I believe that can happen, I just don't think it will. Right? And we have to overcome that. Jesus's crowds, they didn't have that problem. So when they see Jesus healing the sick, when they see Jesus opening the eyes of the blind, or healing the lame, or casting out demons, they start to think, this is the guy I want to be around. And so it's just natural that a good teacher, somebody in Jesus' position, would get up and they would follow somebody in Jesus' position. Somebody doing what Jesus could do was doing what Jesus did and taught. They would gather a large crowd. Not only would we see that as a sign of success, but so would people in Jesus' time. Now, what is just fascinating is Jesus turns to them. It's like he's following along, and then he does this 180, turns toward the crowd that's literally following him from place to place. And he says this, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father, mother, wife, children, brothers, and sisters, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. That is not the fastest way to win a crowd. That's not the fastest way to gain a following. Jesus starts out, he says, if you wish to come to me. Now, come to me is a very interesting phrase that Jesus uses, because there was this group of people who were quite literally following him from location to location, but Jesus wants to make a distinction. At this point, Jesus isn't talking to his 12 disciples. He's not talking about his closest group of followers. He's now looking at the crowd that is beginning to confuse proximity to Jesus, hearing the message of Jesus, and encountering the works of Jesus as following Jesus. And Jesus wants to define things right away. Listen, you can follow me and you can wish to come to me, but that does not mean that you are a disciple of me. There's actually a very, very big difference between being in close proximity with Jesus, hearing Jesus' teachings, and being a disciple of Jesus. In fact, scholar James Edwards gives us clarity when he states, a disciple might assume that coming to Jesus is one of several relationships he or she might enjoy. And hearing the word of Jesus, one of several words that he or she might hear. You know, we live in a world where we just get to add whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want to our life. We like this aspect, we like this teaching, this author, this piece of advice. We're going to take it, we're going to fit it into our life. I like this activity, I'm going to participate in that activity. And our lives become this kind of conglomeration. They become this kind of patchwork quilt of all of the things that we like and are drawn to. Now in our society today, Jesus is often one of those things. Not for everybody, but actually for a lot of people in America, Jesus is one of those things. He is a patch on the quilt. And Jesus himself wants to make a distinction in the crowd that's seeking to come to him. He says, I'm not actually just a voice among voices. I'm not a philosopher among philosophers. I'm not a teacher among teachers. I'm not an example among examples. I'm not a thing among things. So if you want to come to me, Jesus says, then you have to understand something. Then Jesus uses this really, really strong language. He says, if anybody wants to come to me and does not hate father and mother, wife, children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Jesus goes through this whole list of relationships, and he uses the word hate. That should shake us a little bit. Right? Because just a couple weeks we said, at the heartbeat of relating to one another, at the heartbeat of following Jesus is this active love toward one another. In fact, Jesus said, the command I give you is to love one another. Jesus even talked about honoring and obeying parents. Jesus talked about loving one another, and now he uses this term, hate. So what's going on? Jesus, do you actually want me to hate my parents? Do you actually want me to hate my siblings? Do you actually even want me to despise myself? Now, one thing we have to understand, well, there's actually two things we have to understand. In a sense, yes. But in a sense, no. Jesus is using a comparative statement. And it was actually very common for rabbis to use the term hate in referring to two different decisions, especially decisions that had the capacity to compete with one another. In a decisive moment where two options are viable and two options are elevated and two options might even be good, Jesus says you have to clearly define and clearly choose which one you will be after. You actually can't go after both things. I can't love my wife and love somebody else the same way. It doesn't work that way. There's competing decisions, and I have to decisively choose one and leave the other one behind. And Jesus is saying, listen, there's a lot of people who want to come to me, but if you don't decisively choose me above every other relationship or every other thing, even anything that you might want, value, or protect for yourself, you can't be my disciple. Now, I think this is a hard word not only for us to hear, but I think this is a hard word for the crowd to hear. They're like, Jesus, we've been following you along. Some of these followers probably even gave money to Jesus for his ministry. And now they're probably looking at Jesus and thinking, Jesus, I'm a little bit confused. Because you had all this good teaching, and you're teaching us to love one another, and you're loving us through your act. We love being around. All we want to do is be around you. And Jesus says that's true, but what you're drawn to is the way I'm doing life. And if you want to do life the way I do life, you have to understand it's going to cost you something. You're drawn near me, Jesus would say. You're drawn close to me because you like the product, you like what my life produces. You like the product of my living, you like who I am. But to get there, if that's what you want to learn to do, it's costly. And so Jesus says even this in verse 27, and whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Jesus uses that same word disciple 3 times in this passage, and the first 2 are right here. If you don't hate this list of people, and Jesus is using hate comparatively, if you don't decisively choose me instead of these relationships, even in comparison with your own life, you can't be my disciple. And on top of that, you have to be willing to take up your cross and follow me. Now, the cross was a torture and execution system devised by Rome to be absolutely excruciating and humiliating. And so the symbol of the cross wasn't just what it was. It wasn't just this torture tool, this execution tool. It was also a symbol of shame. That anybody who was crucified or hung on a cross was a symbol of shame. They were worthy of mockery. And so it wasn't just that somebody was being killed and tortured and enduring pain. It was shame. And not just shame on the person, but on their family. Jesus says, you even have to be willing to be shamed for my sake. And if you can't be my disciple. Now, disciple isn't a word we use a whole lot. I mean, it is in the church, but in the rest of the world, it really isn't. I mean, it's a very church word. We might talk about being a disciple of a certain line of thinking or a disciple of a certain field of study, But when Scripture talks about disciple, it was actually a very simple term. It was a term that meant to be a learner. To be a disciple, that's what that word means. Disciple means learner. And a learner was somebody who would follow another teacher or a master, and they would learn how to live life the way that person lives. And so Jesus is looking at this crowd, following him from one place to another. And he has an indication, he has an inkling that these aren't true followers yet, but some of them might be in the place to want to be a follower of Jesus. They want to learn how to live life his way, but they don't understand the costly nature of living the way Jesus lives. Now, I don't think Jesus is just trying to raise himself to this level of priority. He is doing that. I mean, that's actually like one of the main points of this passage. Jesus is elevating, rallying people around himself as a priority for any disciple's life. But I think he's also going to great lengths to share with the crowds, to share with all would-be disciples the cost of living life the way Jesus lives life. Not just the cost of learning, but the cost of living. I mean, there were moments in Jesus' life where people came and they asked if they could follow him. And he said, you have to understand, I don't even have a home. I don't have a single place to lay my head. If that's what you're after, then I know how to get there. Jesus was hated by so many people. They tried to kill him a lot of times. Even the people who were considered very, very good in Jesus' society. The religious, the leaders, either in the family of God or out of the family of God, they all hated Jesus. And Jesus is like, listen, if you want that way of life, I can show you how to get there. But you have to understand there's a cost. And so that's what Jesus moves on to next. In verse 28, he goes on to two analogies. It says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? If you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. Jesus uses the analogy of building a structure. Now, anybody who builds anything, they have to sit down and they have to come up with a game plan. They have to make estimates. They have to see how much it's going to cost them. And if they can't afford it, they can't do it. Right? That's just simple math. It's simple planning. What Jesus is stating is not complex. It's actually the obvious. Jesus is using something incredibly obvious. If you want to build a tower, don't you sit down and see how much that tower is going to cost to build? Because what happens if you don't do that? If you don't estimate the cost and you just get into the process and realize you can't afford it, then not only have you wasted time and money and effort, but at least in Jesus' day, you are going to be considered foolish. And that was actually a higher price than whatever financial cost there was, whatever cost in time there was, whatever cost in labor there was. Being found out you were a fool is worse. Jesus gives another analogy. He says, or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is a long way off and ask for terms of peace. Jesus elevates the cost. Now it's not just a cost of time and money and shame. Now it is a cost of rule. It's a cost of life and death. Jesus is elevating the analogy to the point of severity. If there's a king who goes to battle and he knows he can't win, wouldn't he send a delegation to the other person? Wouldn't he avoid that battle at all costs because he has counted the cost? Only a foolish king would rush into a battle that he knows he can't win just to die. And Jesus is taking two very serious analogies. And he's saying that this is the severity of following me. This is the severity of having a lifestyle like mine. You might like my teachings, Jesus would say. You might like my miracles. But I'm not sure you're going to like the way I live. And then he gives these analogies so that people can wrap their mind around the importance of the decision they're making. And in verse 33, He starts to drive it home a little bit. He says, in the same way as a builder who counts the cost, in the same way as a king who counts the cost, those of you who do not give up everything that you have cannot be my disciples. I think there's a church in America who likes the idea of Jesus. I think there's a church in America who likes the teachings of Jesus. I think there's a church in America who likes the love of Jesus. What is there not to like about Jesus? What I don't think we like is the cost of Jesus. I don't think we like the cost of following Jesus. So much so, I'm not sure we think about it. Man, the church in America will do anything to get a convert to Jesus. But before people convert, Jesus stands up and he says, listen, I need you to know something. You want to follow me, I'd love for you to follow me, but I don't think you're ready. That's a really good way to lose your following. But Jesus understands the importance of what it means to be a follower and a disciple of Jesus. A disciple isn't just somebody who likes to be in proximity with Jesus. A disciple isn't even somebody who likes the teachings of Jesus. I'm going to take it one step further. A disciple isn't just somebody who obeys the teachings of Jesus. A disciple is somebody who lives the way Jesus lived. A disciple is somebody who is becoming like Jesus in their inner being, and a disciple is somebody who does the things Jesus did. And in order to get that way, it's a great cost. How much is the cost? Based on verse 33, it's everything. What does it cost to be a disciple of Jesus? It costs everything. Everything. I was standing in a conference one time about discipleship, and the speaker was going on about what it takes to be a disciple, and even more than that, what it takes to make a disciple. And he said something that really just captured my mind, and I actually hated it in the moment. He said, discipleship, it takes all of my time, it takes all of my money, and it takes all of my attention. I was like, that doesn't sound right. But the longer I live into my discipleship, my following of Jesus, learning to live like Jesus, and the longer that I sit with Jesus, the more I realize that guy was right. But what does it cost to follow Jesus? It actually costs everything. It costs everything. I've heard people in the church arguing about how much should we be giving of our money. Like, is it 10%? Or shouldn't I pray about it? Couldn't it be lower than 10%? Like, maybe. But when I look at the followers of Jesus in the New Testament after he sends the Spirit, it costs them everything. They sold everything they had so that nobody would have need anymore. But when we come to the church today, we think, well, it's just like, I'm just supposed to follow the rules and I'm just supposed to not sin, right? Like, that's the point. No, there was a good man who actually approached Jesus one time. He was known as a rich young ruler, and he says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, that was a pretty common question to ask a rabbi. It was a pretty common question to ask a teacher. They asked about this qualitative and quantitative eternal life, like this life that is immeasurably good and lasts forever. They would say, what do I need to do to inherit that life? And then the rabbi would have an answer for them. And so Jesus sees this young guy's answer, or this young guy's question. He sees it for what it is. And he says, you have to follow the law of Moses if that's what you want to do. And the rich young man, he looks at him and he says, well, I've done all of that since I was young. I'm actually really good. I followed all the rules. And Jesus says, okay, one thing you still lack. If you want the life that can only be found with me, I need you to get rid of everything, and I need you to come follow me. Now, I was reading this and meditating on this passage the other day, and what stuck out to me is the young guy doesn't ask Jesus, how can I follow you? The young guy doesn't come and say, Jesus, can I spend more time with you? Can I be one of your disciples? He doesn't ask that. He asks about eternal life, and Jesus' answer is to come and learn how to live like he does. And in order to get there, he's going to have to give up everything. Now, I don't believe Jesus asks all of us to sell everything we have in order to get to be a follower of him. But what I do believe for every single person is this: that disciples of Jesus orient everything around Jesus. Disciples of Jesus orient everything around Jesus. We don't look at the teachings of Jesus. We don't look at the works of Jesus. We don't look at the things we like about Jesus and figure out how we can make those things happen in our lives. Disciples of Jesus orient everything around Jesus. And I believe the church in America has a problem because we're trying to figure out how Jesus orients around our life. And the problem is, it's like, I don't have time for Jesus. I'm busy with this thing. Jesus would say, okay, are you willing to give that up for me? That's your cost. Jesus, I don't have time for prayer. Okay, well, what's in the way? Are you willing to give that up? That's your cost. But Jesus, this is a really good opportunity that I have. That's fine. Is it going to help you become a learner of who I am and a way of life that I live? Because if not, that's your cost. We can't have lives that somehow try to fit Jesus into it. We have to orient our life around Jesus. And I promise you, it will cost you everything. At least in terms of a decision. At least in terms of love. At least in terms of affection. If it's in the way, get it out of the way. If it inhibits, cut it off. Jesus went to just extreme lengths to help people understand this. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Now, Jesus wasn't looking for people who were going to just hurt themselves. That's not what he was after. Jesus was after a group of people who was so radical that nothing would get in the way of their following. If your right hand causes you to sin, he said, cut it off. Jesus is not looking for people with one hand. Jesus is looking for people that will love him more than anything else. He's looking for disciples that will orient everything around himself. Disciples of Jesus orient their lives around Jesus, orient everything around Jesus. All that we are, every decision we make. What's the cost? It's everything. And then Jesus goes off, and at this moment, I'm pretty sure the crowd would probably think he was a little bit crazy because he goes from talking about counting the cost now to salt. You can see the connection clearly, obviously. We all do. Verse 34, Jesus says, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? My family likes to watch MasterChef on occasion. It's one of the things we like to do. Every time there's a new season on, our oldest Asa is like, hey, there's a new season of MasterChef. Guess what we're doing tonight? And so we sit down and we eat food that's probably not good for us, and we watch MasterChef, okay? And one of the things that stands out to me about that show is people can be incredibly creative with the presentation of their food, all sorts of the different flavors that they put in their food. But the thing that gets people time and again that the judges always seem to come back to is salt. Well, there wasn't enough salt in this dish. Only one time I heard there's too much salt in this dish. And they could use all sorts of herbs, they could use all sorts of spices, they could use all sorts of creative displays on the plate. But what it comes down to for the judges a lot of the time is salt. I'm like, it takes a show of professional chefs to get us to understand the importance of salt. And so now, I don't do a whole lot when I cook because I'm not great at cooking, but I promise you I use salt. Salt matters. It's always mattered. It's always been a key ingredient because the salt in food, it elevates the flavor. It brings out the richness of what's already there, doesn't it? Now, in Jesus' time, salt had that same function. Salt brought out the goodness and the beauty and the flavor of what is there, what could be there. Not only that, salt was also used to preserve. It was used to preserve things. A little salt brings out the flavor. A lot preserves it. So be careful with your salt intake. I don't know what your goals are for diet. Maybe you want to enjoy your food. Maybe you want to preserve yourself. There is a sliding scale of how much salt you should use. But Jesus says his disciples are going to be like salt. It costs you everything, but here's the outcome of disciples orienting everything in their lives around Jesus. And that is we bring out the flavor in the world. That is we preserve the world, not because we are over it, not because we rule people, not because we do any of that. That's not the point. The point is somebody who learns to live life the way Jesus does will become like salt in the dish. It's the one key ingredient. You can add anything else you want to that dish, but without salt, it's not going to be good. And people who don't consider the cost of following Jesus are going to be like unsalty salt. Last week I said you need to stay away from angry Christians. This week what I want to tell you is be a salty Christian. Be salty. Not in your attitude. I've been salty plenty of times. That doesn't get me anywhere, especially not at home. Okay? But I'm asking us to be salty followers of Jesus. People that live in such a way that there is no cost too high in order to elevate the dish, in order to preserve our surroundings, in order to be the people God has called us to be. You know, Jesus' teachings had this weird backwards way about them. He'd say if anybody wants to save their life, they actually have to lose it. If you want to be my disciple, you have to give up everything. If you want to gain something from me, you have to lose everything. It's going to cost you everything. But the outcome is we become the people we've always wanted to be. Why would anybody, if it costs everything, why would anybody choose to be a follower of Jesus? Because Jesus says, come and taste and see that I'm good. He says, if anybody's tired or weary, come and follow me. My burden is easy and my yoke is light. His own disciples, his own closest followers who had literally given up everything to follow Jesus. There was a moment in Jesus' life where he says another hard thing. Jesus said a lot of hard things, okay? And he said this one hard thing to a crowd, and it was a little bit confusing. He said something even a little bit borderline weird, where he said, if you want to be my disciple, you have to eat my body and drink my blood, okay? We're not going to explain what that means. If it sounds weird today, it sounded weird then too. And so Jesus says this, and this crowd that's around him, they just start walking away. And then Jesus looks at his own disciples and he says, are you too going to leave me? And I think it's this moment of vulnerability where Jesus realizes how high the cost of discipleship is that he's asking from people. And the disciples look back at Jesus and they say, we've given up everything for you. Where else do we have to go? And I don't think that's just a practical confession from Jesus' disciples, like, well, we've already made our choice. Like, there's no going back now. Like, we'd love to be able to leave, but we don't have anything to leave and go back to. I don't think that's their point. I think their point is we've given up everything and we've seen that this is worth it. Why would we give up everything for this one thing? And Jesus says, because that one thing is a source of living water. That one thing is the food that you've been after, that you've been hungering for, and you can't find anywhere else. It's the thing that you will take part in and finally be satisfied. The cost is high, but the reward is incalculable. And there's no other place you can get the reward of following Jesus. There is no other place that life like that can be found. There's no other place where everything that you've been searching for can be had. So yeah, it's going to cost you everything, but you are going to gain so much more. Now, we're putting discipleship in this pretty high bar kind of level. We're putting discipleship in this place, this elevated place of seeming like it's a huge challenge, and it is. But it's not for only the super spiritual. It's not only for the super educated. It's not for the best leaders or the most perfect people. Actually, that's not the point. If you look at Jesus' group of followers, the ones that were closest to him, the ones that said giving up everything to follow him is worth it, it was people who were con men, prostitutes, and uneducated day laborers. Those are the ones that became true disciples of Jesus. Those are the people that were willing to give up everything in order to follow Jesus. You see, the bar for following Jesus is quite high, but the requirements for who I need to be to follow Jesus are for anybody. Anybody can follow, anybody can be a disciple. It's not just for a certain group of people that have a propensity to be able to live a certain way. It's not for people who are really good at following rules. It's not for the super religious. In fact, you'll find time and time again the super religious people were the ones that could never give up what it cost to follow Jesus. Anybody can be a follower of Jesus. Anybody can be a disciple of Jesus if they're willing to count the cost. I want to give you a few ways that we can be true disciples of Jesus, or at least the process of becoming a disciple. And it's things that I'd actually like you first to consider before you go about it. And the first step of anybody being able to be a disciple of Jesus is that you have to count your cost. Okay? Anyone can be a disciple of Jesus, but first you have to count your cost. Now, I'm intentionally saying your cost because your cost is different than my cost. Your cost is different than the person next to you. And Jesus asks us to count the cost, but everybody's cost is going to be different. Everybody has to consider what everything means to them. Because everything for me is going to be different than everything for you. I have different things that I love. I have different things that I value, and I have different things that I struggle with, and you have different things for me. So what I'm asking us to do this morning is to determine if the cost is worth it. And in order to do that, you have to consider your cost. If Jesus is asking you to give up everything, what is your everything? What is the cost to you? Get really personal with it. It's easy to consider the cost for somebody else. It's easy to consider the cost for somebody outside of my life with different desires. It's always easy to see clearly in somebody else's life, but it's so much harder to consider it in our own. We don't become a light to the world by shining a light on the world. We become a light to the world by shining the light of Christ inside on us first. And the first step of that is considering the cost. What's in there that you'd like to keep in there and not give up to Jesus? Maybe it's a struggle, maybe it's an addiction, maybe it's a stronghold, or maybe it's just a greater love of a really good thing. But it's taken the place of Jesus. That's your cost. That's your cost. The next step of being a follower of Jesus is to deny ourselves. Really positive message today, right? This is a hard message today, guys. If you're feeling it, I need you to know I'm feeling it. I was almost in tears in my office, Lord, I'd rather preach something else today. Can we go back and talk about love again? People like that one. They really like that one. And I just keep coming back to this. I'm like, no, it's hard, but it's worth it. We have to count the cost, and then we have to deny ourselves. Now, count the cost, count your cost, deny myself. Those are kind of two sides of the same coin. One is theoretical, it's possible to count the cost and decide, that's not for me. But another one is to deny ourselves, which is the hardest message for the American church to have, because our mantra in our society is do what makes you happy as long as it doesn't hurt somebody else. That's our line, right? It can't hurt somebody else because then you infringe on their rights, but everything else is within my realm of self-governance and rights. So as long as I'm doing something, it should make me happy and it should not hurt somebody else. That's the rules. And the gospel of Jesus is come and die. Those are opposing messages. One has the promise of life and one has the promise of death, and it's not the one at face value that you'd think it is. Denying ourselves is actually part of the good news. How is it good news? Well, our second oldest loves the game Roblox on his tablet right now, okay? I was going to ask for a raise of hands, but I don't want to make some really very mature adults raise their hands because you play Roblox, okay? But Roblox is a game on a tablet, and he's enamored with it. He loves it. If we let him, he would play that game all day long. And in moments of weakness, that has happened. What he desires, what Ezra desires, is to be able to play this game all day long. He would never tell himself no. And there's moments where we just need a little bit of peace and quiet. We're just like, that's autopilot, right? We're going to go with that for today. Or, there's just some really practical moments. We don't do it a lot, but there's some practical moments where we've been on long road trips and we're like, yes, we're going to turn on a hotspot. You can play that game. Let's just get where we're going. But there's always a cost on the other side. He would never tell him no for that game, but at the same time, he can never pull himself out of it. If we let him give in to what he wants, but isn't good for himself, it ruins the day, it ruins the atmosphere, it ruins the mood for the rest of the family, and he becomes a rotten person. I'm not saying he is when he can't pull out, maybe borderline, but if we just gave in to what he wanted all the time, my kids would become rotten people. They would become entitled people. They would become people who believe the world revolves around them, and there would be a very thinning line between do whatever makes me happy, but don't hurt other people, and just do whatever makes me happy, regardless of the cost. When we get what we want all the time, it's actually not good for us. And sometimes we think, but I want it, it makes me happy. And the Lord's like, but it's not good for you. Well, what is good for me? I'm good for you. So denying ourselves is saying no to even the things that we think are good for us, but aren't Jesus for us. They're the things that we think will bring us life, but really what they bring is death, not just to us, but to the people around us. They make us into rotten people. It's not a great message, but it's the only one I have. We got to learn to deny ourselves if we want to be disciples of Jesus, to where our will and desires over time become aligned with the will and desires of God for us. And the longer you pursue Jesus, the more you press into him, the more you practice denying yourself for what Jesus has for you, the more you'll actually find that what you want and what Jesus wants are lining up more and more every single day. Over time, your desires and your will become in line with that of Jesus's. That's where true life really starts to abound. That's where everything we want really becomes satisfying and good and pure and beautiful. There's one more step, and that is not just count your costs, not just deny yourself, but also following daily. We have to follow Jesus daily. Now, this doesn't mean waking up one morning and being like, I just got to remember I'm a Christian today. It doesn't even mean telling it to other people. It doesn't mean putting on the Christian t-shirt and walking around publicly. Those aren't bad things. Those are good things. But that's not what it means to follow Jesus daily. It doesn't even mean waking up and saying, I can't sin today. It's a good thing. Don't sin, okay? Just in general, don't. But that's not what it means. Following Jesus daily means continually and constantly surrendering all that we are to Jesus. It means learning to orient our thinking around Jesus, our possessions around Jesus, our finances around Jesus, our time around Jesus, everything around Jesus. And I've heard some people criticize the church. They just want they just want all of my time, they want all of my money. No, but Jesus does. And I'm not saying it has to go all to the church. I'm just saying Jesus does. But more than that, he wants to captivate your heart. He wants to captivate your mind. And all of those things will follow. You know, when we read in the book of Acts, when the church when the church is birthed, When the church is given life and it comes into reality on the day of Pentecost, nobody looked at the new followers of Jesus and said, you need to sell all of your possessions and you need to orient everything around him. It was the Spirit of God in the people of God that produced the fruit of God. And the way we get that is to follow Jesus daily. Jesus, what are you doing today? What do you have for me today? For some of us, this is going to cause radical reorientation. If it's in the way, we have to get rid of it. If it's competing with our desires for Jesus, we have to reorient. For some of us, that's going to mean looking at even the way we structure our day. Well, I'm too tired to pray in the morning. Okay, let's count the cost. Let's deny ourselves. Let's follow Jesus daily. What is that going to be? But my work is too demanding. Okay. Earlier on in society, there's actually there's some jokes around Jewish people in finance, and we're not going to be telling jokes about Jewish people in finance. There's a line there. But there's a reason there's actually a lot of Jewish people in finance, because there was a time in society where the Jewish people felt like they could not participate in culture, in specific roles that were available to them without compromising their following of God. But one thing was open, at least at the time, and it was finance. Nobody else seemed to want it. And so they said, you know what? Nobody else wants it. It's available, and it's gonna allow us to do what we need to do to follow the Lord, and that's what we're after. So we're gonna step into finance. That's how it happened. Because there was a group of people who were willing to reorient everything around the presence of God. Are you willing to wake up every morning and say, what is this moment required of me for following Jesus? Are you willing even to lay your career on the line and say, maybe there's a different career I need if I can't follow Jesus and do this thing? That's your cost. Well, I can't stay up as late as I normally stay up and pray in the morning. That might be your cost. Our cost of following Jesus daily, it eats into every area of our lives. There's nothing off limits for Jesus. Because disciples of Jesus orient everything around Jesus. And that's what it looks like to follow him daily. We follow daily in every decision, in every thought, in every action. We structure our schedules around Jesus. You can't fit Jesus into your schedule. It doesn't work. What you have to do is you have to scrap everything and overhaul the whole system so that your schedule revolves around Jesus. Your decisions revolve around Jesus. Your desires revolve around Jesus. If it doesn't fit it in, don't kick Jesus out, kick the thing out. But that's going to be hard. It's going to feel like loss for a little while. But on the other side of it is going to be abundant life that starts now and lasts forever. It's the only place you can find it. Why would anybody live this way? Because it's worth it. Now we're sharing this Sunday because this is what we're calling this Sunday and next Sunday our Vision mini-series. It's a strategic thing to help you understand some important pieces for the life of this church that we're going to be talking about in specific detail on September 8th. Now, we're going to have a lot of expressions of it, but discipleship and being disciples of Jesus is at the heart of this church. There is nothing else. It's discipleship. It will always be discipleship. It's at the heart and it's at the future of this church, is becoming and making disciples and launching disciples outside the walls of this church to fulfill the calling that God has given them when they reorient their everything around Jesus. When we have disciples that count the cost and realize I'm willing to give up everything to follow Jesus, those are the disciples we want to celebrate, elevate, and launch. Not so that you can come and serve us, but so that we can serve you to do what God has equipped you to do. Because there is something locked up in you that only the salty lifestyle of a disciple of Jesus can unlock, bring into reality, and be good news to the world. That's what we're after. It's not a low bar. It's a high bar, but that's what we're after. Now I better pray for us because this is a lot this morning. I want to invite the worship team up.